Good morning and welcome to our National Safe Work Month webinar. We're really excited that you were able to join us to have this discussion this morning. So based on the invitation, you'll know that the sorts of things we wanted to talk about really relate to the way in which COVID-19 has changed the workplace health and safety landscape. I'm privileged to have with me this morning Hilary Searing, a Special Counsel in the Brisbane office, Bianca Mendelson, a Senior Associate in the Brisbane office, and Oshi Fagir, a Special Counsel in our Sydney office. So there's been a number of gaps emerging in the way in which COVID is being managed, and I think there are many areas of future exposure for people dealing with workplace health and safety. We need to think about how we might start dealing with COVID fatigue and how to engender a strong safety culture that's critical to ensuring a safe workplace. We want to make sure that we can position you so that you can manage the ongoing risks that will develop and evolve during these sorts of crises. And we also want to have a bit of a chat to you about some of the major work health and safety developments for 2020. So why don't we start with you, Hilary? I've got some questions for our panel of experts today. Hilary, how has COVID-19 shaped the WHS landscape?
Thanks, Jen, and morning, everybody. Well, I think at the beginning of the year, nobody anticipated that we were going to have a global pandemic. And I think at the heart of it, COVID is a health and safety issue, and it really needs to be addressed as such. And so I think what COVID has actually done, I think it's really shone the spotlight on safety and shown businesses how, of course, safety is always important, but I think it has really shone the spotlight on business and on safety and how important it is to get that right and how important it is to get your risk management processes right and to be able to be nimble and flexible and agile in those processes. So I think it's really given safety professionals a greater voice and a greater opportunities to drive better safety outcomes. So I think in some ways that COVID has brought some positives, if I can say that, out of what is obviously a horrific, pandemic. I think in June earlier this year, the Australian Governor-General said that there's never be a more important time in a workplace health and safety professional's career than helping Australia emerge from COVID, the pandemic, and dealing with that. And I think that's really, for me, been, I think, what is a really important part of shaping the WHS landscape. Thanks, Jen.
There's a lot going on, isn't there, Hilary? Just a bit of housekeeping as we move through. I'm sure you might have comments or questions about the things that our panel of experts talk about. There is a Q&A button and function in the Blue Jeans system, so please feel free to click on that and post in any questions and we'll try and address them as we go through. Hilary, what change do you think has been most surprising?
Well, I think, Jen, what for me has been most surprising is I think, and I shouldn't say this is surprising, but businesses have responded so well initially. I mean, I think they've had to be so nimble and agile and respond so quickly to the pandemic. And I think initially businesses have done that in a really great way. I think what is occurring now, and we'll talk about this a bit more later on in the presentation, I think is where some gaps are emerging is I think there might be a bit of a set and forget. And now that we've done some of these things, we obviously need to keep managing them. And I think what I've also seen is that businesses are tending to respond using things like the health advice and government advice, but that obviously isn't a substitute for a business conducting its own risk assessment processes and managing its own risks on the ground. And they will still need to make sure that they are managing those things and that sometimes there's been so much focus on COVID that they are not considering perhaps the other risks in the business or how the COVID changes or the changes that they're having to bring in to implement COVID might actually affect other risks within their business. So I think that's a change that I'm seeing.
I think that's a really great point, Hilary. There really isn't a one-size-fits-all approach that can be adopted for COVID, is there? What advice do you have for businesses moving forward given the uncertainty?
So I think what I think one of the biggest gap areas and one of the easiest ways for business to help manage these things and make sure that they really are continuing to be flexible and able to deal with the changing landscape is to make sure that they've really got their risk assessment processes in place so that they've done a proper risk assessment, and that's an area where we're seeing a lot of gaps. Businesses are not often conducting a risk assessment about COVID, and what that means they might be dealing with it, but they're not necessarily dealing with that in a structured and procedural way. So what we would recommend is that they actually have a proper risk assessment that deals with the issues of COVID, but also the other risks so that the other risks and controls within their businesses that I just mentioned aren't forgotten and don't create other unintended hazards for the business.
I think that's really great advice. Oshie, I think this is a pretty stressful time for Australians, and as Hilary says, the obligations are ongoing and in some circumstances can feel a little bit overwhelming. There's been a lot of discussion about the increased risks of mental health issues in that kind of environment. You only need to look back at the news to observe the abuse of retail workers during the toilet paper stockpiling incidents, the increased work demand on essential workers and worker isolation and working from home arrangements to realise that mental health is likely to be a really significant issue for many people across the board. Can you talk to us a little bit about business obligations regarding risks to mental health?
Sure. Thanks, Jen, and thanks everyone for joining us this morning. But this is a really interesting and quite difficult question from a WHS perspective and really from an HR perspective. And we've, for the most part, and rightly so, been really focused on dealing with COVID and mitigating its effects as far as we can. And that, of course, that's crucial. But the mathematical fact is that the number of people who will be directly affected by COVID is far smaller. It's a tiny fraction of the total number of people who will be affected by our responses to COVID. And there's no doubt that those responses are going to affect people's mental health within and outside the workplace. So let me quote something that the National Mental Health Response Plan, this is a joint intergovernmental plan, has said about what's likely to happen. I quote, "Currently available data indicates that there are higher levels of reported anxiety and psychological distress in the general population. There's strong evidence from previous pandemics that there are risks of increasing mental health, including new presentations of mental distress and illness, increased substance abuse and increased risk of suicide in the longer term." So really very well established and very serious mental health consequences for really the community. Now, employers aren't responsible to deal with every mental health challenge that exists in the community, but certainly to the extent that work and workplace conditions are contributing or influencing mental health, there is a responsibility to deal with them. And that applies equally whether someone's physically in the workplace, working remotely from home, whatever it is, it doesn't really change. And it's clear there are a number of ways in which work and work arrangements can impact on mental health. Probably the first and most obvious one is the isolation and the disruption of social routines for those of us who are working from home primarily or to some extent. There are often increased work demands that come about from restructuring or other changes, cost cutting in some situations, and just from the shift to a different mode of working and to working from home. Organisational change is always, even under the best of conditions, a source of real stress and anxiety, lack of support, poor clarity around expectations in a changed environment, difficulty separating work from home. I mean, the list goes on. There are any number of ways that our responses to COVID, while necessary and really important, have, as Hilary touched on, has some real potential to create unintended consequences. And there's no doubt to my mind that to the extent that employers can influence those matters, that there's a legal obligation to assess those risks and to deal with them.
Okay, so if employers do have a legal obligation to manage the psychological risks caused by the work environments or work arrangements, could you talk to us a little bit about what some of the control measures are that could be deployed to manage the risks?
Sure. So easy enough to say there's a problem, much more difficult to identify the solution. Now, the National Mental Health Response Plan that I mentioned suggests some initiatives, and I'll just list them quickly. Supervision and support opportunities, particularly for employees working from home, increased opportunities for training and professional development, addressing staff shortages, implementation of mentally healthy workplace initiatives, and introducing or continuing access to employee assistance programs. Now, all of those things are good ideas and sensible on one level, but there's a real challenge in translating those high-level sort of concepts into a plan that's going to be effective in your particular workplace. And quite frankly, I don't have a one-size-fits-all or any clear response to what's going to be effective in a particular workplace, but I do have 4 suggestions that might be useful. The first and most important thing to my mind is to understand that these psychological risks or psychosocial risks are work health safety risks that need to be treated in the same way as any physical risk. So they might be more difficult to identify, but they're no less real, and there is an obligation, just like there's an obligation to guard against risks of trips and falls or whatever it might be, there is a legal obligation to deal with these things, and as Hilary's mentioned, to assess the risks in a structured way, consistent with the prescribed way that we have to assess workplace risks. This isn't a matter of some sort of best practice or some progressive idea. It's a matter of basic legal obligation, in my view, and it has to be approached that way. And the second key point, I think, is that you've got to talk to your staff. Now, again, this is a legal obligation. You've got to consult with your workers about work health safety risks and the way that you should respond to them, but it's a good idea to do it anyway. If you're trying to work out what your staff need to keep them psychologically safe, probably the best starting point is to ask them. Again, that's not a matter of some new age approach to employment relations. It's a matter of what the law requires. The third point is that I think in most workplaces, and this will vary depending on whether people are working from home or any other number of variables, but reversing that disconnection that comes from someone being picked up, taken out of the office and dropped at home or wherever else, I think that's a really important step. Again, infinite number of ways that can be done. The obvious ones are regular check-ins, whether it's on Zoom or Skype or when it's possible to meet in person to do it. But trying to reverse that isolation, I think, is important. And then the fourth thing is, it's important to think about what's changed from your staff's point of view and how their needs and the nature of the work has changed. Things more, for some people, might be easier to work from home, but for most people, there are going to be new challenges, and at least initially, and maybe forever, it's going to be more difficult. People may need more support. You might need to think about how work is scheduled. You need to think about how you help your people draw a line between work time and leisure time, all of those things. But again, it's just a matter of the first step, sitting down and thinking about what's changed for my workers and what does that mean in terms of the impact on them and the things that I need to do as an employer to help mitigate those. So no silver bullet, but they're just some of the things I'd be thinking about if I were trying to work out how to deal with this issue in a particular workplace.
Thanks, Oshie. That's really helpful. One of the things that I've observed in working with workplaces to respond to COVID is that a lot of the focus tends to be on the workers and the staff members who have been asked to have a different working pattern or start working from home. One of the areas that I think is probably of concern and probably also needs some attention from employers is the psychological risk and the health and safety of those in the executive or the crisis response team who are managing sort of the core incident response portion of what's going on here. So what we've observed is that businesses are often very good at having a red team and a blue team who alternate, for example, for their workers, but they don't have the same kind of boundaries that they're putting in place for the executive team or for those in HR or WHS who are having to do the bulk of the lion's share of the work to implement these strategies and are the ones who've really been put under the pump. So I think it's really interesting to think about the application of some of the ideas you've just discussed to those particular cohorts, because I think they're under particular pressure at the moment. Do you have any observations in relation to that?
I agree completely. And we're talking about how people's work has changed and thinking about that. Well, this is a whole new set of challenges from the perspective of the people who are managing and trying to work out how to deal with this. So it's really created a whole new degree of difficulty for people in the positions that you've just described. And the reality is often a group of people have to look after everyone else, but then who's looking after that group? So in short, I agree completely with what you've said, Jen, and I think it's something, it may sometimes be self-care, it may be something that's a concern of a board or perhaps the very highest level of management to look after their teams, but whatever it is, it's absolutely a real issue and sometimes overlooked, as you pointed out.
Thanks, Oshie. Hilary, this move to working from home has been quite monumental. Many workers started working from home almost overnight earlier in the year in order to comply with the government's lockdown measures. Even as the restrictions ease, there are news reports of some large corporations such as Microsoft making working from home a permanent option. What are the relevant WHS risks for working at home arrangements?
Thanks, Jen. I think to take your earlier point about the executives, and I think this leads into the working from home issues and the mental health or psychological health issues that Oshie has been just talking about, is that I think that this pandemic, it's been going on almost we're in October now. People were sent home, I think, in March. And I think normally if you're dealing with a crisis situation, which at its heart, I think is what COVID is, and a safety issue, those often are things that we are used to dealing with in terms of short-term situations like bushfires or floods or cyclones and so on, especially up here. And I know that when we had the floods up here in Queensland, we were all sent home and we had to work at home for a couple of weeks and things like that. So those kind of arrangements I think businesses are used to. But this is, and I hate to use the trite terms, but it's unprecedented. And I think what we are seeing, I think, is that is also creating some unexpected risks of this long-term working at home arrangements. So generally, from a legal perspective, of course, we've always had people have the ability to ask to work from home and to request flexible working arrangements. And businesses are very used to dealing with that. They're used to, okay, well, let's have an ergonomic check and let's have everybody at home and we might send somebody out to their home to check that their setup is ergonomic, and that is because in essence, if somebody is working at their kitchen table or at home, it's still a workplace for the purposes of the Work Health and Safety Act if they're undertaking work, and we still have the same obligations as an employer to ensure that to ensure their health and safety so far as is reasonably practicable. And I guess that's the important point is what was reasonably practicable, I think, in March when we sent everybody home, as you said, Jen, almost literally overnight, is not necessarily what's going to be reasonably practicable right now in October, so many months on. And I think that that's what I was talking about earlier in terms of the set and forget. I think a lot of businesses and organisations have sent people home and they've gotten, we've sorted out the IT issues, we've got everybody working, we are doing the Zoom meetings, as Oshie mentioned, we're catching up. But I think people then need to now take it to this next level and say, well, hang on, actually, what was reasonably practicable then, we're now so many more months down the track, we probably do have some more obligations now. We probably need to be thinking about that ergonomics and the long-term issues of people working at home. And that, I think Oshie flagged this earlier, that delineation, I think, is such a critical aspect to this between when are people at home and when are they actually working. And I think with social media and accessibility and Wi-Fi and internet and everything, we are already blurring the boundaries of work and home so much in the modern workforce as it is, but just this pandemic takes it to a whole new level. And I think that some of the really critical aspects is we've seen clients, for example, trying to engender some sort of social and community, which is great from psychosocial mental health aspects and driving up culture and increasing positive outcomes. But, you might be having Friday afternoon Zoom drinks during work time at 4:30 p.m., but you might have a zero tolerance alcohol policy for your workplace. People then might, the managers and things might drop out of the call, and people might stay on the call and continue having a house party or a Zoom party. Where does the workplace stop? Where does the work end? And what happens if there's an incident or somebody is bullied or harassed in that forum? So I think working from home arrangements is where I see a critical risk area that businesses really need to be stepping up and taking more control over than what I've been presently seeing.
Hilary, I think that's right. There's a lot of challenges, aren't there, in the working from home space. Have you got any suggestions about the sorts of controls people might be able to use to help manage those risks?
And I think this is a bit like Oshi's no silver bullet here, Jen, but and no one size fits all. But I think what would be some sensible recommendations would be for people to try and make sure that we are actually delineating, those work hours for our people, that we're setting expectations, for example, and this doesn't work for every workplace, as I said, but, you might be saying you are expected to be online between the hours of 9 and 5. If we're seeing people who are logging on a lot earlier or logging on a lot later, that's then something that can be dealt with. We can, even potentially, shut off systems and processes at certain times so that we, effectively closing the workday. And the reason why that becomes important is in terms of if an incident was to happen at home, the employers still have obligations to investigate those incidents. So you need to be reminding our people that an injury or an incident that occurs at home is still reportable. We still need to be investigating those things. We need to be training our managers and our people on how to actually conduct an investigation where somebody's at home and an injury has happened at home, and to consider whether, for example, that injury occurred as a work-related matter, or perhaps they were on a break or going for a run or something on a lunch break. So, and we really need to consider all of those factors and whether that constitutes a sufficient break from work and so on. So I think there's a lot of things, and what Oshi was talking about, making sure that we're training our managers and supervisors to touch base and to keep in contact. And interestingly, I just was talking to someone earlier this week, and they were saying that the visual health is now becoming a concern, because so many, which is something I hadn't even turned my mind to, that so many people are on these type of meetings and doing these sort of things the whole time, that in actual fact it's impacting on people's vision. And so they were sending out something to their workforce to remind them to try and take regular breaks and to rest their eyes, and with the constant electronic meetings, and having things like perhaps a walking meeting and so on. So I think there's a variety of things and controls that employers can do, but like Oshi said, there's not sort of one silver bullet here, and I'd very much recommend that people look at it in terms of their own risks for their workforce.
Thanks, Hilary. Gosh, there's a lot of things for people to think about at the moment, aren't there? And certainly as you move up that chain of responsibility, it can sometimes feel pretty onerous and overwhelming. Bianca, I'm interested to kind of go up that chain of responsibility and have a bit of a chat to you now about some directors' due diligence obligations. So even before the pandemic began, directors were under increasing pressure by government and society in relation to increased feelings around corporate social responsibility and expectations of what corporations should be doing. What are some of the key issues relating to directors' WHS duties that people should be keeping in mind?
That's right, Jen. Directors and officers do have that duty of due diligence to ensure that their business complies with the WHS Act in the harmonised jurisdictions that's found in Section 27 of the WHS Act. So this duty was there before COVID and it remains. It's not changed. However, the way that the officers discharge this duty has changed due to COVID. For example, one of the duties is for officers to keep up-to-date information on safety matters and to keep up-to-date knowledge about hazards in the workplace and the best ways to control these hazards. And what we know about the virus now has changed significantly from what we knew about the virus earlier in the year, and just the rapid speed of how information is changing and the volume of that information directors and officers are obligated to continue to be up to date with that information and then change the controls in the workplace as needed to reflect the best practice and most current health advice. And as you said, before COVID pandemic, we were seeing greater scrutiny by the regulator on officers and directors. We were even seeing examples of where the regulator would be proactively finding out from officers what they were doing to discharge those due diligence obligations, even in circumstances where there hadn't been an incident or any suggestion of a breach. It was just the regulator discharging their obligations under the WHS Act to monitor safety. So what we're expecting is now that we're moving from the initial reaction to COVID and it's more of the long-term controls that we need to put in place, we're expecting that the regulator will continue to focus more heavily on businesses and particularly what the directors and officers are doing to ensure that the companies discharge those WHS duties.
Thanks, Bianca. Gosh, it is a lot, isn't it? Do you have any good practical tips that you can give to assist people discharging their statutory obligations?
So not only is it important to undertake those reasonable steps that the Act obliges the directors to do, but it's also vitally important to keep records and good thorough records of what you're doing. So if at any time in the future that questions are asked about what you did as a director to comply with those obligations, you have your records, the contemporaneous notes that you took at the time. And directors they're not meant to be perfect. They're not meant to make perfect decisions every time. But if you can capture what you knew about the hazard and what was publicly available on the means of controlling that hazard at the time that you made that decision, that will go a long way to for you to be able to show and demonstrate the reasonable steps you took to carry out that due diligence obligation.
Thanks, Bianca. One of the things that I find particularly useful is to put a little separate folder in your Outlook or a separate folder in your file management system and just label it WHS, and you can just drop your little documents in there, and if anything ever comes up, you've got a really nice centralised spot that you can go to in order to provide proof to the regulators that you are doing the right thing. Oshi, regulators, they're our favourite people, aren't they? Can you tell us what has been the safety regulators' response to the pandemic, both at the start of the pandemic and as of today?
Sure. Talking about a regulator, it can be a bit difficult to generalise because the regulator's an agency and has policies and rules and so on, but it acts through its inspectors who are individuals, some of them many, very professional, very capable, and who implement the agency's policy very strictly, and then there are others who have more inventive approaches. But subject to that caveat, that there are some observations we can make. Firstly, in terms of COVID-related compliance specifically, the regulator's been active, including in terms of enforcement. I mean, a huge amount of activity in terms of education and generating materials and so on, but also active in terms of enforcement, although so far mostly at the lower level of fines, improvement notices and so on. I think the stats in New South Wales are about $700,000 worth of fines issued by Safe Work New South Wales to hospitality business or COVID-related issues. No prosecutions yet, as far as I can tell. Hilary and Bianca will correct me if I'm wrong, but no doubt to my mind there are some coming through the pipeline. In terms of everything other than COVID, the approach has been a little bit different. Back in April, all the regulators, or all the regulators apart from Victoria, issued a statement of regulatory approach, and they said essentially they recognise that COVID's created a difficult set of circumstances for most enterprises, and the approach to enforcement will reflect that. And most importantly, they said, quote, "The regulators will take a supportive and educative approach to compliance during this time." Good, but there's more. Goes on to say, supportive and educative approach provided duty holders have made genuine attempts to comply with the requirements, but compliance is affected by factors outside their direct control. So if you're doing your very best and taking the job seriously and doing what you're supposed to be doing, but there's some one of the many challenges that have been thrown up that's created some non-compliance, the indication is that there'll be a supportive or a corrective type of approach as opposed to the more punitive approach. And more specifically, the regulators have said they'll take into account PCBU's or enterprises' ability to meet duties given the constraints that are associated with the pandemic. So that rush to work from home is one example of places where probably there have been a lot of non-compliance, but as a product of exigencies. The regulators have said they'll respond to serious incidents and fatalities as normal. They'll continue their core administration work of issuing licences and so on as normal, and they'll use enforcement tools as appropriate, but subject to the slightly gentler approach that I've just touched on. So in terms of non-COVID, a bit of a change, but I think the key thing to appreciate about that statement is that it's now 6 months old, and the view that was taken about the effect of the pandemic, the constraints associated with it in April, are not going to be the same as the view that's taken now that we've had 6 months to adjust to this. So I think that it's really important to view the things that I've just said in that light, that this statement's 6 months old, and the more time goes on, the more demanding the regulator's going to be. And there are some signs that things are getting back to normal. For example, Safe Work New South Wales has just published a draft code of practice for dealing with psychological risk, which is something that's been on the agenda for a little while and now seems to be back in full swing, not dealing specifically with COVID-related issues, but for psychological risk generally. So if I had to summarise all that, I'd say there's been a bit of a grace period, but we're getting back to normal pretty quickly.
Thanks, Oshie. It has been going since March, and Hilary, you said before that this is a bit unlike a normal crisis, in inverted commas, in the sense that those normal crises tend to be over a much shorter period of time and people have a much shorter response period. The response to COVID's been running for a good 6 or 7 months now. I think people are probably starting to get a bit of COVID fatigue. How do we ensure that WHS continues to be a priority for people?
Thanks, Jen. And look, I agree. I think people are becoming almost immune to the risks in some way. I think people are hearing it over and over, and they're sort of almost like, oh, COVID. So that's a real issue, and for me, I think it's a leadership issue. I think everybody they don't want to hear platitudes from their leadership. I don't think they want to hear that we're all in this together, or let's be kind to one another. And I think those statements are very important and they're useful, but I think people have become almost immune to some of that. And I think as the impacts of COVID continue to be felt in terms of a business sense, I think obviously we're seeing more restructuring and people might be losing jobs and changing the nature of what was the workplace. The new normal is a phrase I also hate, but we might end up having to become used to a different operating model. And I think people are, as I said, becoming sick of those platitudes. And I think, as I said, this is a leadership issue. And I think the way that we can do that is to make sure that if, as the leaders of the business, you are driving change, you need to be take your workforce on the journey with you and make sure that they're understanding the reasons for these really important business decisions that are being made. And if there's restructuring and job losses, explaining why those might need to occur, almost showing, I guess, that you're, and again, just to take another platitude, but you're in the ditches with them, and to help people understand, so that I think it becomes real as opposed to sort of a platitude, or another, COVID, the new normal, we're all in it together, so on. So for me, as I said, Jen, I think they want that, the workforce, I think, is wanting more, leadership and not to put more on our poor leaders at the moment when, as we've talked about extensively this morning, this is obviously a long and draining and ongoing issue for people. But that's where I think they still have some more work to do in this area to keep, bringing the people along on the journey with them, because the risk is that if everyone's ignoring the controls that we're putting in place in the business, that creates a lot of additional risk for the business.
Look, that's really interesting, isn't it, Hilary? It's been a very tough economic time for a lot of businesses. The impacts of COVID economically, as opposed to from a safety perspective, have been significant. How do you think the economic impacts will affect WHS in organisations?
Well, I think we're going to have to, what I would like is that for not to affect safety in businesses, but I think that's something that is really important. I think we've seen some really recent cases where cost cutting and safety have been a real issue or a real front and centre in terms of potentially why some of these serious incidents have occurred. And Bianca will be talking a little bit more about that later on. But so I think when you're restructuring businesses and, jobs are being lost and people are potentially doing, consolidating roles, I think there is that tendency for businesses to look at cost cutting. And I think that it's really important from a safety perspective to make sure that when they are looking at those arrangements, that they're making sure that cost cutting is not at the expense of a safety outcome, and that, whoever is making the decisions on the cost cutting is not leaving it down solely to the people lower down the chain to make decisions on what can and can't be cut, without making sure that safety is a pivotal consideration of that.
There's an interesting intersection.
Sorry, Jen. I was going to say, I think it also goes back to Oshi's point earlier about the psychosocial risks and mental health. I think that WHS is really going to become front and centre when you have things like restructuring and redundancies. As Oshi mentioned, it's never a good time in a business. Organisational change is always hard, and so I think that businesses are also going to have to ramp up their how they address those mental health aspects of organisational and restructuring change. Sorry, Jen, I cut you off.
Not at all, Hilary. I was going to say there's an interesting intersection between economic pressure, WHS pressure and compliance. And I think that creates a pretty ripe environment in some circumstances for people to feel dissatisfied or unhappy with the way things are being managed. And what we see in those circumstances often is an increase in complaints from people about the way in which things are being dealt with. Oshi, I know that you're very live to this issue, and I know that the private sector whistleblower regime was significantly strengthened last year. The laws provide new protections for whistleblowers and introduce severe civil and criminal penalties, including jail time, where the new laws are breached. Given the myriad of compliance issues arising from the pandemic, including economic and WHS issues, what effect do you think COVID is going to have on an organisation's whistleblower complaints?
It's certainly something that's been very much on the agenda pre-COVID, with the changes to the Corps Act taking effect at the start of this year. And of course, there are different regimes that apply in public sector in different states and territories, so it's really a concern for everyone. There is now ample new fodder for complaints, as you've pointed out, Jen, whether it's just pressure on workers and other people in organisations leading to dissatisfaction, or real challenges in terms of dealing with restructuring, with things like JobKeeper compliance and tax compliance generally, business and supply chain disruption. There are a whole new universe of areas where things can go wrong in a business, which could legitimately generate a whistleblower complaint. There's also an economic pressure and the pressure on staff that, I mean, quite frankly, is going to increase the prospects of there being complaints which are not legitimate, which are motivated by some other reason, to desire to get a payout or to get back at someone or whatever reason. So I think that it's likely that there'll be an increase in legitimate and less legitimate whistleblower type complaints as a result of the pandemic. Now, with so many things going on, it's probably quite tempting to put this on the back burner and think, we dealt with that last year. We've got our systems in place for the 1st of January and, let me deal with the 30,000 other things on my to-do list. But as we know, with whistleblower complaints and grievances generally, the worst thing you can do is not deal with them properly, because that just tends to make things much worse. So it has to be on the agenda, and we have to deal with it and deal with the disruption to our usual systems that's come about. So number one, remote working is going to reduce the visibility that managers have over employees generally, and employee issues, disputes and concerns. If a complaint is made, it can easily be lost in the shuffle given everything else that's going on. So some of the things that we've touched on today, especially for often very senior people who are charged to deal with these things that have other really important strategic priorities, restructures and redundancies, changes in reporting lines, staff leaving the business can all really compromise the usual machinery for whistleblowing, and then impacts on third parties can affect their capacity to do what they need to do to help you deal with whistleblowing issues. So a whole new set of reasons for complaint, a whole set of challenges in dealing with them. Again, a very difficult situation, but something that just demands attention. There's no alternative to dealing with it, in my view.
Thanks, Oshie. I think that's a really good reminder to people to not set and forget, which is one of the things we've said a few times during this session. Whistleblower complaints can be really challenging, can't they? Have you got any hot tips for things that can be implemented to reduce the risks of a company breaching the whistleblower laws?
Look, I think flexibility is key, and I'm sorry, I feel like I'm just, listing cliche after cliche, but I think it's the reality is that you really need a flexible policy that's going to reflect your business as it exists today, not as it existed 9 or 10 months ago, and that can adapt itself to situations. Just keeping the policy up to date and having it front of mind, and making sure that as things change, your policies and processes change, making sure that where there is change, it's communicated to staff so everyone understands what the process now is and where people should go with these issues, and how they'll be dealt with if complaints are raised, and reminding staff that they have the option of raising legitimate concerns in a particular way, and that they'll be supported when complaints or concerns are raised in a bona fide way, that just in a context where people are already anxious and concerned. It doesn't hurt to remind people that there's a process and that there is support for people who raise these issues, and usually quite a extensive procedure for supporting people, protecting anonymity where appropriate, and so on and so forth.
Excellent. Thanks, Oshie. Bianca, we've discussed the impacts COVID has had on safety, but can you provide us with an update on some of the broader major developments that have occurred in the WHS space in this year that are not related to COVID?
Right. COVID has understandably dominated the WHS space this year. However, there are a number of significant changes that has happened across Australia throughout all the jurisdictions, which is very important to keep in mind. Industrial manslaughter was one of the biggest topics of last year. Now there are 4 states and territories that have the industrial manslaughter offence. So that's Queensland, Victoria, NT and ACT. Queensland has by far had the most activity with the new provisions, that being industrial manslaughter. So the first matter was involved a company called Brisbane Auto Recycling Pty Ltd. So this matter finalised in June 2020. In this case, a worker was crushed by a forklift. the court found that the company had no systems in place relating to traffic management, including no traffic management plan, and also the person driving and operating that forklift didn't actually have a forklift license. So the breaches in this case were quite clear-cut. The company pled guilty to the charge of industrial manslaughter and was fined $3 million. This was out of the maximum of $10 million. In August 2020, the WHS prosecutor in Queensland announced that he had charged the first ever individual with industrial manslaughter. So this relates to a Gympie business. So it's the Gympie director and business owner of a company was charged with industrial manslaughter. This matter also involved the fatality involving a forklift. So the most interesting part of this matter is that it is the first time a person has been charged, and he, if convicted, would be facing a maximum penalty of 20 years imprisonment. So this is certainly the most significant fine in the WHS space that we've seen. South Australia and Tasmania don't have industrial manslaughter, and they've been quite vocal saying that they won't. Given the state's current Liberal government, it's unlikely that this position will change. The Labor governments across the other states and territories have been key in making these amendments. Western Australia is currently in the process of harmonising, so it's still Western Australia and Victoria who haven't harmonised their WHS legislation, but they're looking to do that. It's been on the agenda for the past few years now, but it's slowly working its way through Parliament. So perhaps by the end of the year or next year, that will then pass. So as a part of the proposed WHS Act in Western Australia, they are looking to have an industrial manslaughter offence, but it's going to be a two-tiered system. So the first tier will be the more significant one, that would be a crime, and then the second lower tier is going to be a simple offence. So this is a significant departure from what all the other jurisdictions who do have industrial manslaughter have. So again, the introduction of industrial manslaughter is sort of staying the edges of harmonisation. So it's particularly important for companies who are operating across multi-jurisdictions to recognise that although the states and territories are harmonised, that significant offence of industrial manslaughter is different, and in WA's circumstance quite significantly different. New South Wales has elected not to introduce an industrial manslaughter offence. However, they have put an explanatory note in the WHS Act clarifying that that manslaughter under the Crimes Act in New South Wales can apply whenever there is a death in a workplace. So this has always been the case. Whenever there is a death in any workplace across any of the jurisdictions, manslaughter under the criminal code is available. But New South Wales has put this note in just to make it clearer to everyone involved that this is an avenue that the prosecutor could go down. Also in New South Wales, they have amended the Category 1 offence. So Category 1 offence in New South Wales is the most serious offence. Previously and across all the other harmonised jurisdictions, Category 1 applies to reckless conduct. Historically, proving recklessness beyond a reasonable doubt is quite difficult. We nearly had one in Queensland, but it was ultimately overturned on appeal. So recognising that it is such a high threshold to prove that the person was reckless in their conduct, which then caused the offence. They've amended that in New South Wales and added the gross negligence element. So in the second reading speech, the New South Wales Parliament actually stated that this has been done with the intention to make it easier to successfully get a prosecution for the Category 1 offence. Another key change in New South Wales is the change to insurance. So starting from 1 July, it is now an offence to enter into a contract of insurance which would seek to cover your penalties for WHS. So that applies to both companies and individuals. So it's now you're now unable to seek insurance for a WHS fine. This doesn't apply to insurance policies that would cover defence costs So anything leading up to being convicted and having a fine. So the appropriateness of these types of insurance policies has been a topic of discussion for many years. Many have said that it is against public policy because the very nature of WHS financial penalty is to deter from that behaviour, that unsafe behaviour. So now New South Wales has implemented this recommendation. This was recommended in Marie Boland's review a few years ago into her review of the WHS harmonised legislation. As yet, it is only New South Wales who has implemented the recommendation. It was recommended to Queensland in 2017, but they at the time declined to go with it, but still yet to be seen if their position will change. Western Australia's harmonised legislation, which is making its way through Parliament, does include that. So by this time next year, there'll be both New South Wales and WA, provided it passes, will now have that prohibition on insurance policies. And then finally, Dreamworld matter finalised this year. So this relates, of course, to the tragic 2016 accident where 4 people were killed. So the coronial inquest started last year, and it was quite a lengthy process which wrapped up in November last year, and the coroner provided his findings in February this year. The topic I'm talking about, findings of Dreamworld, could be a full seminar in itself. The coroner was scathing of Dreamworld and its management, particularly noting that the directors didn't know about many of the issues, therefore they couldn't take any action. The coroner said that Dreamworld and its management had a systemic failure in relation to all aspects of safety. Some of the key issues that came from that, as Hilary touched on before, was the maintenance budget was cut a few months before the accident happened. So, and that was brought up repeatedly throughout the inquest. So when you are, as Hilary mentioned, when you are making those decisions, of course, money might be tighter now, but still prioritising making sure that there's sufficient resources for the WHS, and that is in fact one of the director's duties of due diligence, to ensure that there are proper resources for WHS matters. The coroner referred the matter to the Queensland WHS prosecutor, and mid this year the prosecutor announced that Ardent Leisure had been charged with 3 Category 2 offences. Dreamworld pled guilty to all of the offences quite quickly. They didn't seek to challenge the charges. So the company was facing, because each of those charges have a maximum penalty of $1.5 million. So they ultimately were fined $3.6 million, which was by far the most significant WH offence in pretty much all of Australia. So now that Dreamworld has wrapped up, there are significant learnings that companies should be taking from that, particularly around the safety culture, making sure that safety culture from top down is set and encouraged and maintained. Thanks, Jen.
Thank you, Bianca. That was really helpful. All right, just to wrap up, we're getting close to the end of our hour. I'm going to ask each of the experts on our panel to turn their minds to a crystal ball, gaze into 2021, and give me one thing that they think is going to be significant from a WHS perspective arising from COVID. We might start with you, Oshie.
Sure. Pre-COVID, we had a real emphasis by regulators on psychosocial hazards, which is anything in the design or management of work that creates risk of or increases the risk of work-related stress. It was really focused on bullying and harassment and procedures for dealing with bullying and harassment complaints. Not only, but that was really what it tended to be about in practice, and we had some sort of ad hoc interventions by inspectors issuing improvement notices and so on. Establish a compliant process for managing bullying and harassment complaints. But it was a massive headache. But a bit random. My expectation is that focus will continue in the new year, but with the added layer of COVID-related psychosocial risks, and I would expect that there'll be a real focus on some of the things that we've been talking about, this new category of risk that's been created and the steps that have been taken to deal with them. And I suspect in a more structured way than we've had so far, so more consistent intervention. I mentioned the draft code of practice for dealing with psychological risks, which the New South Wales regulators just issued. I think that'll be the hot topic, and with this whole new feature of COVID, remote working, etc., hazards in the mix. That's my guess.
Thanks, Oshie. Hilary, what's in your crystal ball for 2021?
I was going to say I agree with Oshie. I think that the psychosocial hazards are just going to become an increasing area of focus. I think if I'm looking at 2021 as well, and I think I'm an optimist. I'm ever an optimist. I'm hoping we'll get a vaccine shortly, or everything will resolve in some fantastic way. But I think when all the dust settles from COVID, I think that what we are going to see is a real, and Oshie's talked about this, a real focus from the regulator on how organisations actually addressed health and safety. And I think that they're going to, have that benefit of hindsight and sort of sitting there in a nice, not taking perhaps into account the exigencies of the situation and how quickly businesses needed to make those decisions. So I think there'll be a very strong focus on any failings that have arisen out of this, and I think that's a really important reason why businesses need to make sure that they really still keep an eye on the ball and focusing on these matters, and in particular their risk assessments, because that will help them have a clear plan on what they're doing. And as Bianca said, at least if they've articulated that, they've assessed the risks, they've addressed it, I think that puts them in a much better position to deal with any criticism or scrutiny from a regulator, Jen.
Good ideas, Hilary. Bianca, do you have anything in your crystal ball that's different?
I think there'll be this continuing of that increased scrutiny on the officers, and throwing into the mix the fact that New South Wales and then soon WA will have that prohibition on the WHS penalties. I think we'll see a lot more directors and officers really and sharply turning their mind to what they need to be doing to demonstrate their WHS obligations.
I think you're probably right, Bianca. There's certainly a trend towards that in the cases that I've worked on. Hilary, Oshie and Bianca, thank you so much for your time and energy today. I found that a really useful discussion. Hopefully our attendees did as well. We've now come to the end of our hour. I'd like to thank everybody very much for attending. Wish you all a very good day.
Thanks, Jen.
Thanks, Jen.